I spent 37 years building memories with my daughter Melissa, carefully documenting every milestone in photo albums that lined my living room shelves. Last Christmas, when I asked her to pose for what I thought would be our final family portrait together, she rolled her eyes and said I was being, quote, ridiculously dramatic about some stupid pictures. 3 weeks later, I discovered she'd been secretly meeting with lawyers about my estate, assuming I'd leave everything to her ungrateful hands. That's when I decided to show her what real drama looks like. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rita Lawson, and I'm 74 years old. I live in a modest 2-story house in Cedar Falls, Iowa, the same house where I raised Melissa as a single mother after her father walked out when she was 3. For over 3 decades, I worked double shifts at the regional medical center, first as a nursing assistant, then later as a patient coordinator. Every paycheck went toward Melissa's needs, her education, her dreams. I never remarried, never took vacations, never bought anything for myself that wasn't absolutely necessary. My life revolved around giving her the foundation I never had. The house isn't much to look at from the outside, but inside it tells the story of our life together. Every wall displays carefully framed photographs spanning Melissa's childhood through her adult years. First day of kindergarten, piano recitals, high school graduation, college acceptance letter, her wedding day, the birth of my grandson Tyler. I organized them chronologically, creating a visual timeline of all the moments that mattered. Photography became my passion because it was the only way I could hold on to time, preserve the fleeting moments when Melissa still looked at me like I hung the moon. I had professional portraits taken every few years, always making sure Melissa and I were both dressed nicely, hair done, sitting close together with genuine smiles. These weren't casual snapshots, but formal documentation of our bond, proof that despite everything we'd been through, we remained connected. The photography studio downtown knew me by name. I'd schedule sessions months in advance, sometimes splurging on the deluxe package, because I wanted these images to last forever. Melissa tolerated the photo sessions when she was younger, but as she got older, especially after she married her husband Derek and moved to the upscale neighborhood across town, her enthusiasm waned. She'd show up to family gatherings looking slightly annoyed when I brought out my camera. She'd make comments about how I was obsessed with pictures, how I needed to live in the moment instead of constantly trying to capture it. But I persisted because I knew these photographs would be all I had left someday. Last December, I decided it was time for our final professional portrait. I'd been feeling my age more acutely, dealing with arthritis in my hands and a persistent cough my doctor couldn't quite explain. I wanted one last beautiful image of Melissa and me together, something that would represent the culmination of our relationship. I called her in November to discuss it, suggesting we coordinate our outfits and book the session for mid-December. Her response was lukewarm at best. She said she was busy with holiday preparations, that Tyler had basketball tournaments every weekend, that Derek was stressed about year-end deadlines at his accounting firm. I offered to pay for everything, including professional hair and makeup if she wanted. I even suggested we could include Tyler in some of the shots. She eventually agreed, but I could hear the reluctance in her voice. The morning of the photo session arrived crisp and clear. I'd spent weeks preparing, getting my hair colored and styled at the salon, purchasing a new burgundy blouse that complemented my complexion. I arrived at the studio 15 minutes early, as I always did, and waited in the reception area with nervous excitement. This felt momentous, like the closing chapter of a beautiful book. Melissa showed up 20 minutes late, rushing through the door with her purse half open and her hair slightly disheveled. She was wearing a plain black sweater and jeans, despite our conversation about dressing up for the occasion. When I gently mentioned that perhaps she might want to change into something more formal, she sighed heavily and said we didn't have time because she had other commitments that afternoon. The photographer, a kind woman named Sarah who'd worked with us several times over the years, tried to lighten the mood. She suggested various poses, encouraged us to relax and smile naturally. But Melissa's discomfort was palpable. She kept checking her phone between shots, barely making eye contact with the camera or with me. When Sarah asked us to move closer together for an intimate mother-daughter pose, Melissa shifted away slightly, creating visible distance between us. Halfway through the session, I made what I thought was a reasonable request. I asked if we could take a few extra shots, maybe try some different backgrounds and lighting setups. I explained that this would likely be our last professional portrait together, that I wanted to make sure we captured something truly special. I was willing to pay for the additional time and prints. That's when Melissa's patience finally snapped. She looked directly at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of irritation and embarrassment, and said loud enough for everyone in the studio to hear, "Mom, you're being ridiculously dramatic about some stupid pictures. They're just photographs. This obsession you have is honestly embarrassing." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation as Sarah and her assistant pretended to busy themselves with equipment adjustments. The silence in the studio was deafening. I'd been called many things in my life, but never dramatic, never obsessive, and certainly never embarrassing. These weren't just pictures to me. They were the visual documentation of my greatest achievement, proof that despite all my sacrifices and struggles, I'd managed to raise a daughter who grew up beautiful and successful. I quietly told Sarah we were finished and paid for the session we'd already completed. Melissa stood by the door checking her phone while I settled the bill. We walked to our cars in silence. Before she drove away, she rolled down her window and said, "I'll see you at Christmas dinner," as if nothing significant had happened. But something had changed in that moment. The foundation of how I saw our relationship had shifted, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. That evening, I sat in my living room surrounded by decades of photographs, trying to understand how the daughter I'd devoted my entire adult life to could dismiss something so meaningful to me as mere vanity. I wasn't asking for much, just a few hours of her time to create one final memory together. Instead, she'd made me feel foolish for caring, small for trying to preserve something beautiful. I spent the next few days replaying the scene in my mind, analyzing every word and gesture. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't an isolated incident. Over the past few years, Melissa had gradually distanced herself from me. Our weekly phone calls had become monthly check-ins. Family dinners happened only on major holidays. When I suggested activities we could do together, she always had excuses about being too busy or too tired. Christmas dinner at my house was tense and subdued. Melissa arrived with Derek and Tyler, bearing expensive wine and store-bought desserts. She complimented my cooking but seemed distracted throughout the meal, constantly monitoring her phone and cutting conversations short. Tyler, now 16 and absorbed in his own teenage world, barely looked up from his device. Derek made polite small talk about work and weather, but clearly preferred discussing anything other than family matters. I'd prepared a small photo album of pictures from throughout the year, including the shots from our December session that had finally arrived from the studio. When I presented it to Melissa as part of her Christmas gift, she flipped through it quickly and said, "Thanks, Mom. These are nice." But she didn't linger on any particular image or comment on how we looked together.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
She set the album aside and moved on to opening other presents. That night, after they'd gone home, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about my relationship with my daughter. Had I been deluding myself about how close we were? Had my efforts to document our bond actually been pushing her away? Was I really as dramatic and obsessive as she'd suggested? But then I remembered all the years I'd worked overtime to pay for her college tuition, the nights I'd stayed up helping her with school projects, the way I'd celebrated every achievement and comforted her through every disappointment. I remembered the times she'd thanked me for always being there, for always believing in her. Those moments had been real. Something else was happening here. 2 weeks after Christmas, I received a call from my longtime friend Margaret, who worked as a receptionist at the law office downtown. She was calling to give me a heads up about something that had troubled her. Margaret had overheard a conversation between one of the attorneys and a client that she thought I should know about. The client was Melissa, and she'd been asking detailed questions about estate planning, specifically about how to expedite probate proceedings and whether there were ways to contest wills that seemed unreasonable or emotionally manipulative. Margaret was careful not to reveal attorney-client privileged information, but she was concerned enough about what she'd heard to reach out to me. She suggested I might want to have a conversation with Melissa about my estate plans, or perhaps consult with my own attorney about protecting my wishes. The implication was clear. Melissa was already planning for my death and positioning herself to challenge anything that didn't align with her expectations. I thanked Margaret for the information and hung up feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. My own daughter was meeting with lawyers behind my back, not to help me with my estate planning, but to strategize about how to circumvent my decisions after I was gone. She wasn't just dismissive of my sentimental attachment to family photographs. She was actively preparing to override my autonomy even beyond the grave. That night, I pulled out my current will, a simple document I drafted 5 years earlier that left everything to Melissa. The house, my savings account, my life insurance policy, my modest investment portfolio, even my jewelry and personal belongings. I'd assumed she would treasure these things because they connected her to our shared history. I'd imagined her living in the house where she'd grown up, maybe raising Tyler in the same rooms where I'd raised her. But now I understood that Melissa saw my estate as nothing more than assets to be liquidated. She wasn't interested in preserving memories or honoring our relationship. She was calculating the monetary value of my life's work and strategizing about how to access it as quickly as possible. The photographs that meant everything to me would probably end up in a dumpster within days of my funeral. I spent the following week researching estate attorneys and reading about different types of wills and trusts. I learned about charitable foundations, scholarship funds, and organizations that helped single mothers and children in foster care. I discovered that there were meaningful ways to ensure my life's savings would continue making a positive impact long after I was gone, rather than simply funding Melissa's already comfortable lifestyle. The more I researched, the more excited I became about the possibilities. I could establish a scholarship fund for nursing students at the local community college. I could endow a program that provided professional photography sessions for low-income families, ensuring other parents could document their children's milestones, even if they couldn't afford studio portraits. I could donate to organizations that supported abandoned elderly people, those whose adult children had written them off as dramatic or embarrassing. But before I made any irreversible decisions, I wanted to give Melissa one final opportunity to show me who she really was. I needed to confirm that her dismissive attitude toward my values and her secretive legal consultations represented her true feelings, not just temporary stress or miscommunication. I decided to test her in a way that would reveal her authentic character. I called Melissa and asked if she could come over for coffee the following Saturday. I told her I wanted to discuss some important family matters and needed her input on a few decisions I was considering. She agreed, though I could hear the reluctance in her voice. She probably assumed I wanted to plan more sentimental activities or burden her with my health concerns. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly. I prepared coffee and set out some pastries I'd picked up from the bakery, trying to create a welcoming atmosphere despite the serious nature of our conversation. When Melissa arrived, she seemed distracted and kept checking her watch as if she had somewhere more important to be. We settled in the living room, surrounded by the photographs that chronicled our life together. I began by telling her how much our relationship meant to me, how proud I was of the woman she'd become, and how grateful I felt for all the joy she'd brought into my life. She nodded politely but seemed uncomfortable with the emotional tone of the conversation. Then I shifted to discussing my estate planning. I explained that I'd been thinking about my legacy and wanted to make sure my wishes were clear and properly documented. I mentioned that I'd been considering various options for how to distribute my assets, and was interested in her thoughts on what would be most meaningful. Melissa immediately became more engaged in the conversation. She started asking specific questions about the value of the house, my savings balance, and the terms of my life insurance policy. She suggested that I should keep things simple and straightforward, avoiding complicated trusts or charitable donations that might create unnecessary delays in probate. She recommended that I work with Derek's accountant to minimize estate taxes and ensure efficient transfer of assets. Throughout this discussion, she never once asked what would make me happy or how I wanted to be remembered. She didn't inquire about my values or express interest in honoring my wishes. Her focus was entirely on maximizing and expediting her inheritance. It became clear that she viewed my death as a financial transaction rather than the end of a cherished relationship. Near the end of our conversation, I mentioned that I'd been feeling sentimental lately about our family photographs and was considering having some of them professionally preserved, or perhaps creating a memorial album that could be passed down through generations. I watched carefully for her reaction. Melissa's expression immediately shifted to barely concealed annoyance. She said that keeping old photographs was impractical and sentimental clutter that would just burden future generations. She suggested that I should focus on practical matters instead of dwelling on the past. She even went so far as to say that after I was gone, she planned to digitize any important photos and dispose of the physical albums because they took up too much space. That comment crystallized everything I needed to know. Melissa wasn't just indifferent to the things that mattered most to me. She was actively planning to eliminate them. The photographs that represented my life's greatest joy would be reduced to digital files or deleted entirely. The visual history of our relationship would disappear as if it had never existed. After Melissa left that afternoon, I sat alone in my living room feeling a profound sense of clarity. I'd given her every opportunity to demonstrate care, respect, or even basic curiosity about my feelings and wishes. Instead, she'd revealed herself to be someone who saw me primarily as an obstacle standing between her and her inheritance. She wasn't mourning the prospect of losing me. She was strategizing about what she'd do with my money. That evening, I made an appointment with a highly respected estate attorney named Patricia Hendricks, whose office was located in the next town over to ensure privacy. I told Patricia's receptionist that I needed to completely restructure my estate plan and wanted to explore options for charitable giving and conditional bequests. I scheduled the appointment for the following Thursday and spent the intervening days researching organizations that aligned with my values. I discovered the Cedar Falls Community Foundation, which provided grants to local nonprofits serving vulnerable populations. I learned about the Iowa Nursing Education Scholarship Fund, which helped non-traditional students pursue healthcare careers. I found a national organization called Family Legacy Photography that provided free portrait sessions for families facing terminal illness or economic hardship. Each of these organizations represented something meaningful to me, something that would ensure my life's work continued making a positive difference after I was gone. Contributing to these causes felt infinitely more satisfying than simply enriching Melissa's already comfortable existence. My appointment with Patricia Hendricks exceeded my expectations. She was a compassionate listener who understood both the legal and emotional complexities of family estate planning. When I explained my situation, she didn't try to talk me out of my concerns or suggest that I was overreacting. Instead, she helped me explore various options for structuring my estate in ways that reflected my values, while still providing some inheritance for Melissa. Patricia explained that I could create conditional bequests that required certain behaviors or achievements before assets were distributed. I could establish charitable trusts that would provide income to designated beneficiaries while directing the principal to worthy causes. I could even include specific instructions about how personal belongings should be handled, ensuring that meaningful items weren't casually discarded. We spent 2 hours discussing different scenarios and their implications. Patricia helped me understand how to balance my desire to support charitable causes with my natural inclination to provide for my daughter, even if she didn't appreciate or deserve my generosity. By the end of our meeting, I had a clear plan for restructuring my estate in a way that reflected my true priorities. The new will we drafted was comprehensive and detailed. The bulk of my estate would be divided among several charitable organizations, with specific amounts designated for the Nursing Scholarship Fund, the Community Foundation, and Family Legacy Photography. Melissa would receive a modest inheritance sufficient to acknowledge our relationship without funding her indifference to my values. More importantly, I included specific provisions regarding my personal belongings, particularly my photograph collections. Rather than leaving these items to Melissa to dispose of as she saw fit, I designated them for donation to the local historical society, which had expressed interest in preserving family archives that documented life in Cedar Falls over the decades. My photographs would become part of a permanent collection, ensuring that future generations could study and appreciate the visual history of ordinary families like ours. Patricia also helped me draft a detailed letter explaining my decisions, which would be read aloud during the probate proceedings. In this letter, I documented Melissa's dismissive comments about family photographs, her secret consultations with attorneys, and her obvious focus on maximizing her inheritance rather than honoring my memory. I wanted there to be no ambiguity about why I'd chosen to direct my assets toward charitable causes rather than enriching someone who viewed my death as a financial opportunity. The letter concluded with a statement about the importance of respecting elderly people's values and wishes, even when those values seem sentimental or impractical to younger generations. I wrote about how dismissing someone's deeply held beliefs as dramatic or embarrassing reflects a fundamental lack of empathy and respect. I explained that true love involves honoring what matters to people we care about, not calculating the monetary value of their lives. After finalizing the new will, Patricia and I discussed the timing of its execution. She recommended that I not reveal the changes to Melissa immediately, as this might prompt her to increase pressure or even attempt to challenge my mental competency. Instead, we agreed that I would continue behaving normally while ensuring that all legal documents were properly filed and witnessed. I left Patricia's office feeling lighter than I had in months. For the first time since that humiliating scene at the photography studio, I felt like I had control over my own life and legacy. Melissa could continue dismissing my values and planning to liquidate my memories, but she would not profit from her indifference. My life's work would support causes and people who shared my belief that preserving family bonds and helping others were worthwhile pursuits. Over the following weeks, I maintained my normal routine while secretly savoring the knowledge that I'd reclaimed my autonomy. When Melissa called for our monthly check-in, I listened to her complaints about work stress and Tyler's teenage attitude without revealing that I'd restructured my entire estate plan. When she mentioned upcoming expenses or financial concerns, I nodded sympathetically while knowing that she'd have to solve these problems without my unwitting subsidy. The most satisfying part was planning how and when to reveal the changes to Melissa. I wanted her to understand that actions have consequences, that treating people dismissively can result in losing their support and affection. But I also wanted the revelation to serve an educational purpose, demonstrating that elderly people aren't passive victims waiting to be managed by their adult children. I decided to wait until my 75th birthday, which was approaching in 3 months. I would host a small celebration and use the occasion to share some important announcements about my future plans. This would give Melissa one final opportunity to demonstrate genuine care and respect, while also providing a natural context for discussing estate matters. In the meantime, I began implementing other changes that reflected my newfound clarity about relationships and priorities. I started volunteering at the Community Foundation, helping them evaluate grant applications and develop donor recognition programs. I enrolled in a digital photography class at the community college, updating my skills while meeting other people who shared my passion for capturing meaningful moments. I also reached out to old friends I'd neglected while focusing so intensively on my relationship with Melissa. I discovered that several of them had experienced similar disappointments with their adult children, and we formed an informal support group that met monthly for coffee and honest conversation about the challenges of aging with dignity. These new activities and relationships reminded me that my identity wasn't entirely defined by my role as Melissa's mother. I was a skilled professional, a generous community member, and a loyal friend. I had interests, talents, and values that existed independently of my daughter's approval or appreciation. This realization was both liberating and empowering. As my birthday approached, I began planning the celebration with careful attention to creating opportunities for meaningful interaction. I invited Melissa, Derek, and Tyler, along with several close friends and my new colleagues from the Community Foundation. I arranged for the event to be held at my house, surrounded by the photographs that told the story of my life and values. I also commissioned a special photography project for the occasion. I hired Sarah, the photographer from our last difficult session, to document the birthday celebration and create a commemorative album. I explained that this would likely be my final professional photography project, and wanted it to reflect the joy and connection I'd found with people who truly appreciated my values. The morning of my birthday dawned bright and clear, filling me with anticipation for the conversations and revelations ahead. I spent extra time preparing, choosing an outfit that photographed well, and arranging the house to showcase my most treasured family portraits. Today would mark the beginning of a new chapter in my relationship with Melissa, one based on honesty rather than her assumptions about my passivity. As I put the finishing touches on the party preparations, I reflected on how much I'd changed since that humiliating moment at the photography studio. I'd transformed from someone who absorbed criticism and questioned her own judgment into someone who stood confidently behind her values and decisions. Melissa had intended to diminish me by calling me dramatic, but instead she'd awakened a strength I didn't know I possessed. The doorbell rang, signaling the arrival of my first guests. I took a deep breath, smoothed my skirt, and walked toward the door with my head held high. Today would be the day I reclaimed my narrative and showed everyone, especially my daughter, that being dramatic sometimes means being brave enough to demand the respect you deserve. The guests began arriving at 2:00 sharp, just as I'd planned. Margaret came first, carrying a beautiful orchid arrangement and wearing the navy dress I'd complimented at church last month. She hugged me warmly and whispered that I looked radiant, which made me smile because I felt it too. There was something powerful about knowing exactly where you stood and what you intended to do about it. My new friends from the Community Foundation arrived together, bringing homemade gifts and genuine enthusiasm for celebrating my milestone birthday. Dorothy had crocheted me a beautiful cream-colored shawl, while Helen presented me with a leather-bound journal embossed with my initials. These women barely knew me compared to Melissa, yet they'd put more thought and care into their gifts than my daughter had shown in years. Sarah, the photographer, arrived early to set up her equipment discreetly around the house. She remembered my preference for natural lighting and candid shots that captured authentic emotions rather than forced poses. As she arranged her cameras and tested angles, I felt a flutter of excitement about seeing my life documented by someone who understood the artistry and meaning behind preserving moments. Tyler showed up alone around 2:30. Looking uncomfortable in khakis and a button-down shirt that clearly represented Derek's idea of appropriate birthday party attire. At 16, he towered over me now, but he still gave me a genuine hug and seemed pleased when I told him how handsome he looked. We chatted about his basketball season and his plans for summer vacation, and I was reminded of why I'd always enjoyed my grandson's company. Unlike his parents, Tyler hadn't yet learned to see me as a burden or an inconvenience. Derek arrived 15 minutes later, apologizing profusely for running late due to a client emergency at the office. He carried an expensive bottle of champagne and a card signed by both him and Melissa. When I asked where my daughter was, he explained that she'd gotten held up at the salon but would be here soon. His tone suggested this was a common occurrence, and I wondered how often Melissa kept people waiting while she prioritized her appearance over their time. I decided not to let her absence dampen the celebration. I invited everyone to gather in the living room, where I'd arranged comfortable seating that encouraged conversation and allowed easy movement for Sarah's photography. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the wall displays of family photographs and creating the warm, inviting atmosphere I'd hoped to achieve. Dorothy asked about the history behind some of my favorite portraits, which gave me an opportunity to share stories about Melissa's childhood and our family traditions. I talked about the annual Christmas morning photos where we'd document each year's gifts and growth, the graduation pictures that marked major educational milestones, and the candid shots that captured everyday moments of joy and connection. As I spoke, I noticed Helen and Margaret exchanging glances that suggested they recognized something significant in my storytelling. These women had raised children of their own and understood the love and dedication required to create such a comprehensive visual history. They appreciated the effort involved in coordinating professional sessions, preserving albums, and maintaining displays that honored family bonds. Tyler listened with interest I hadn't expected, asking questions about pictures from his own childhood and requesting details about family members he'd never met. He seemed fascinated by the continuity represented in my collections, the way individual photographs connected to form a larger narrative about our family's journey through time. His engagement reminded me that not everyone in the younger generation was indifferent to preserving memories. Margaret complimented my organizational system and asked how I'd managed to keep everything so well preserved over the decades. I explained my methods for archival storage, digital backup, and climate control, sharing tips I'd learned through years of research and practice. She mentioned that her own family photographs were scattered and deteriorating, and asked if I might help her develop a preservation plan. The conversation naturally evolved into discussions about legacy and memory, with each guest sharing their own perspectives on what they hope to leave behind for future generations. Dorothy talked about her quilting projects, and the family stories embedded in each pattern. Helen described her recipe collection and the cultural traditions she was documenting for her grandchildren. These discussions reinforced my conviction that preserving family history was both meaningful and valuable. Unlike Melissa's dismissive attitude towards sentimental clutter, these women understood that photographs, recipes, quilts, and stories served as bridges between generations. They connected past and present while providing foundations for future family identity. Around 3:15, Melissa finally arrived in a flurry of apologies and explanations about traffic delays and salon emergencies. She looked impeccable, as always, with perfectly styled hair and flawless makeup. Her outfit was designer quality but seemed chosen more for making an impression than for celebrating her mother's birthday. She carried a large gift bag and immediately began distributing air kisses and compliments to everyone present. I watched carefully as Melissa surveyed the room, noting her subtle reaction to my guests and the conversation in progress. Her smile remained fixed, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes when she realized this wasn't going to be a small, easily managed family gathering. She'd expected to find me alone, or perhaps with one or two elderly neighbors, not engaged in animated discussion with articulate, accomplished women. Melissa's gift was expensive and beautifully wrapped, but it revealed how little attention she paid to my actual interests and preferences. Inside the elegant bag was a silk scarf in colors I never wore, and a coffee table book about European architecture that would gather dust on my shelves. The gifts were generic luxury items that could have been purchased for anyone, lacking the personal thought and consideration that had characterized the presents from my other guests. I thanked her graciously and displayed the gifts prominently, but the contrast was obvious to everyone present. Margaret's orchids were already brightening my kitchen windowsill. Dorothy's shawl would provide comfort during evening reading sessions. Helen's journal would soon be filled with my thoughts and observations. Melissa's gifts would remain decorative, but unused reminders of the distance between us. During the cake ceremony, Sarah captured some beautiful shots of the group gathered around my dining room table. The photographs would show genuine smiles and warm interactions, with one notable exception. While everyone else appeared relaxed and happy, Melissa's expression remained guarded and slightly forced. She participated in the singing and applauded appropriately, but her body language suggested she was performing rather than celebrating. After cake and coffee, I announced that I had some important news to share with everyone. I explained that reaching 75 had prompted me to reflect on my priorities and make some significant decisions about my future. The room fell quiet with respectful attention as I prepared to reveal the changes I'd been planning. I began by expressing gratitude for all the relationships that had enriched my life, particularly the new friendships I'd developed through community volunteer work. I talked about the satisfaction I'd found in supporting charitable causes and the joy of connecting with people who shared my values and interests. I mentioned my recent photography classes and my plans to continue learning and growing rather than simply waiting for time to pass. Then I shifted to discussing my estate planning decisions. I explained that I'd recently updated my will to reflect my current priorities and ensure my legacy would support causes I believed in deeply. I mentioned the Nursing Scholarship Fund, the Community Foundation grants, and the Family Photography Program that would provide free portrait sessions for families facing economic hardship. The response from my guests was overwhelmingly positive. Dorothy immediately offered to help promote the photography program through her church connections. Helen suggested that the nursing scholarship could be announced through the community college newsletter. Margaret volunteered to assist with grant application reviews at the foundation. These women understood that charitable giving was an extension of the values I'd lived by throughout my life. Melissa's reaction was dramatically different. Her face had gone pale during my announcement, and she now sat rigidly in her chair with her hands clenched in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the underlying tension. She asked pointed questions about the percentage of my estate designated for charitable purposes and whether I'd consulted with financial advisors about the tax implications of my decisions. She suggested that I might want to reconsider some aspects of the plan to ensure adequate provision for family members. Her tone remained superficially respectful, but her focus was clearly on how these changes would affect her inheritance expectations. I responded calmly that I'd worked with an experienced estate attorney and felt confident about my decisions. I emphasized that my primary concern was creating a meaningful legacy, rather than maximizing financial transfers to beneficiaries. I explained that I wanted my life's work to continue making a positive difference long after I was gone, supporting causes that aligned with my deepest values. The conversation became increasingly uncomfortable, as Melissa persisted in questioning my judgment and suggesting that I was being manipulated by charitable organizations or legal advisors. She implied that elderly people were vulnerable to pressure from groups seeking donations, and that my recent involvement with the Community Foundation might have clouded my thinking. Her comments were insulting not only to me but to my guests, several of whom were also involved in charitable work and understood my motivations perfectly. Margaret finally intervened, pointing out that supporting worthy causes was a personal choice that reflected individual values and priorities. She suggested that perhaps the discussion should continue privately, rather than in front of other guests. But I wasn't finished with my announcements. I still had one more revelation that would demonstrate the full scope of Melissa's miscalculations about my passivity and naivete. I reached for a manila folder I'd placed on the side table earlier and removed several documents that I'd prepared specifically for this moment. I explained that my estate planning process had led me to research various legal options for protecting my wishes and ensuring my decisions couldn't be challenged or overturned by dissatisfied beneficiaries. I'd learned about irrevocable trusts, charitable remainder annuities, and other structures that would guarantee my intentions were carried out exactly as specified. More importantly, I discovered that Colorado law required detailed documentation when estate plans deviated significantly from what might be considered normal family expectations. My attorney had advised me to create a comprehensive record, explaining my reasoning and providing evidence of any factors that influenced my decisions. I opened the folder and began reading excerpts from the detailed statement I'd prepared about Melissa's behavior and attitude toward my values. I quoted her exact words from the photography studio, about my being ridiculously dramatic about stupid pictures. I described her dismissive comments about family photographs being impractical, sentimental clutter. I documented her secret consultations with attorneys about expediting probate and challenging unreasonable wills. The room was absolutely silent as I continued reading. I explained how Margaret had alerted me to Melissa's legal research, and how this information had prompted me to investigate my daughter's true intentions regarding my estate. I described my test conversation, where Melissa had focused entirely on maximizing and expediting her inheritance, while showing no interest in honoring my memory or values. Melissa's face cycled through several emotions during this recitation. Initial shock gave way to anger, then to panic as she realized the full scope of what I knew and had documented. She started to interrupt several times but seemed to lose her voice when she met my steady gaze and recognized that I was completely serious about what I was revealing. Derek looked mortified and kept glancing between his wife and the exit as if calculating whether they should leave immediately. Tyler appeared confused and uncomfortable, clearly unprepared for this level of family drama at what was supposed to be a birthday celebration. My other guests maintained respectful silence, but their expressions showed understanding and support for my position. When I finished reading from my statement, I set the papers aside and looked directly at Melissa. I told her that I'd given her multiple opportunities to demonstrate genuine care and respect for my feelings and wishes. Instead, she'd consistently prioritized her own convenience and financial interests, while dismissing the things that mattered most to me as embarrassing or impractical. I explained that her secret legal consultations had revealed her true character and intentions. Rather than supporting me through the challenges of aging, she'd been strategizing about how to maximize her profit from my death. Rather than honoring my values and preserving my memory, she'd been planning to liquidate my possessions and eliminate the photographs that represented my life's greatest joy. Melissa finally found her voice and began protesting that I'd misunderstood her motivations and taken her comments out of context. She claimed that her legal consultations were intended to protect my interests and ensure my wishes were properly documented. She insisted that she'd never intended to disrespect my values or dismiss my feelings about family photographs. But her protests rang hollow after my detailed documentation of her actual words and behavior. The evidence was too comprehensive and specific for her to explain away as misunderstandings or miscommunications. She'd been caught in a web of calculated indifference that she couldn't untangle with excuses or apologies. I told her that actions had consequences, and that treating elderly people as obstacles to be managed rather than individuals to be respected would result in losing their support and affection. I explained that my new estate plan reflected the natural outcome of her choices and priorities. Since she demonstrated that my values meant nothing to her, she would no longer benefit from the life I'd built around those values. The confrontation continued for another 20 minutes, with Melissa alternating between anger, denial, and desperate attempts at reconciliation. She accused me of being manipulated by my new friends and attorney. She suggested that I was having emotional problems related to aging and isolation. She even threatened to challenge my mental competency if I proceeded with such an irrational estate plan. These threats only reinforced my conviction that I'd made the right decisions. The daughter who truly loved and respected me would never suggest that my autonomous choices reflected mental incompetency. A caring family member would ask what had hurt my feelings and how she could repair our relationship, not threaten legal action to override my clearly stated wishes. My guests remained supportive throughout this difficult exchange, offering quiet words of encouragement and understanding. They recognized that I was defending my dignity and autonomy against someone who'd taken my devotion for granted, while planning to profit from my death. Their presence and support gave me strength to maintain my composure and stick to my convictions. Eventually, Derek suggested that perhaps they should leave and allow time for emotions to cool. He apologized for the disruption and complimented my hospitality, clearly trying to maintain some family dignity despite his wife's behavior. Tyler hugged me goodbye and whispered that he was sorry things had gotten so complicated. His genuine affection reminded me that not all family relationships were contaminated by greed and manipulation. Melissa left without apologizing or acknowledging the validity of my concerns. Her parting words were threats about legal challenges and suggestions that I would regret my impulsive decisions. She gathered her purse and coat with sharp, angry movements that revealed how little control she actually had over the situation, despite her attempts at intimidation. After they left, my remaining guests rallied around me with comfort and reassurance. Margaret observed that standing up to manipulative family members required tremendous courage, and that I should be proud of defending my values. Dorothy agreed that respect was a two-way street, and that adult children who dismissed their parents' feelings forfeited their claims to unconditional support. Helen shared her own experience with a son who'd expected her to fund his lifestyle while showing no interest in her emotional needs or personal values. She'd eventually established firm boundaries that preserved her autonomy and self-respect, though it had required difficult conversations and painful separations. Her story reminded me that I wasn't alone in facing these challenges. We spent the remainder of the afternoon processing what had happened and discussing strategies for moving forward. My friends helped me understand that Melissa's threats were likely empty bluster designed to intimidate me into reversing my decisions. They encouraged me to document this conversation as additional evidence of her manipulative tactics and disregard for my autonomy. Sarah discreetly continued photographing throughout the afternoon, capturing both the confrontation and the supportive aftermath. These images would provide powerful documentation of my mental clarity and the genuine relationships that surrounded me during this transition. They would also serve as evidence that my decisions were made with full awareness and strong community support. As evening approached and my guests prepared to leave, I felt a profound sense of peace about the day's events. I'd accomplished exactly what I'd intended, forcing Melissa to reveal her true character while demonstrating my own strength and resolve. The birthday celebration had become a liberation ceremony, marking my transition from passive victim to active agent of my own destiny. Margaret was the last to leave, staying behind to help with cleanup and offer additional support. As we washed dishes together, she reflected on how much I'd changed since our first conversation about Melissa's legal consultations. She observed that I'd transformed from someone who questioned her own perceptions to someone who stood confidently behind her values and decisions. That transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had required weeks of research, planning, and soul-searching to reach the point where I could confront Melissa's manipulation without backing down or apologizing for my feelings. The process had taught me that demanding respect wasn't selfish or dramatic. It was essential for maintaining dignity and autonomy in relationships with people who preferred compliance to genuine connection. As I prepared for bed that night, I reviewed the events of the day with satisfaction and gratitude. My 75th birthday had marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life, one where my relationships would be based on mutual respect rather than assumed obligation. Melissa could continue her legal threats and emotional manipulation, but she could no longer take my devotion for granted while planning to profit from my death. The photographs from the celebration would join my permanent collection, documenting not just another birthday, but a pivotal moment when I chose self-respect over family harmony. Future viewers would see images of genuine friendship, principled confrontation, and personal empowerment, rather than the superficial pleasantries that had characterized too many family gatherings in recent years. I fell asleep that night surrounded by the visual history of my life and values, secure in the knowledge that my legacy would reflect my true priorities, rather than my daughter's financial expectations. The woman who'd been called dramatic for caring about family photographs had proven that sometimes being dramatic meant being brave enough to demand the respect she deserved. The week following my birthday confrontation passed in a strange mixture of tranquility and anticipation. I maintained my normal routines while waiting to see how Melissa would respond to my revelations. Each morning I tended my small garden, each afternoon I worked on organizing my photograph collections, and each evening I prepared simple meals while listening to classical music. The house felt peaceful in a way it hadn't for months, as if removing the pretense of family harmony had allowed authentic calm to settle in. Margaret called twice to check on my emotional state and offer additional support if needed. She reported that word of my birthday confrontation was spreading through our small community, generating overwhelmingly positive responses from other elderly residents who'd experienced similar disappointments with their adult children. Several women had approached her at church to express admiration for my courage in standing up to manipulation and greed disguised as family concern. Dorothy stopped by on Wednesday with a casserole, and news that the Community Foundation had received its first inquiry about the family photography program I'd endowed. A young mother whose husband had recently been diagnosed with terminal cancer wanted to schedule a professional portrait session for their 3 children. Dorothy had explained that the program wouldn't be fully operational for several weeks, but the woman's gratitude for even the possibility of preserving these precious memories reminded me why I'd chosen this particular charitable focus. Helen brought homemade bread on Friday and shared updates from her own family situation. Her son, the one who'd expected unlimited financial support without emotional reciprocity, had finally reached out to apologize for his selfishness and request a fresh start in their relationship. She was cautiously optimistic, but determined to maintain the boundaries she'd established, recognizing that genuine change required sustained effort rather than momentary remorse. These conversations reinforced my growing understanding that family dysfunction often followed predictable patterns, with elderly parents cast as passive resources to be managed, rather than individuals deserving respect and consideration. The difference lay in how each person chose to respond when confronted with evidence of their adult children's indifference or manipulation. Some continued enabling destructive behavior in hopes of preserving surface relationships, while others found the strength to demand authentic connection or accept painful separation. Tyler called on Thursday evening, speaking quietly as if he didn't want his parents to overhear our conversation. He apologized for the tension at my birthday party and asked if there was anything he could do to help repair the family situation. His concern was genuine and touching, but I explained that the problems between his mother and me reflected fundamental differences in values that couldn't be resolved through mediation or compromise. I assured Tyler that my feelings toward him remained unchanged, despite the conflict with his parents. He was welcome in my home any time, and I hoped we could maintain our relationship regardless of what happened with Melissa and Derek. He seemed relieved by this assurance, and promised to call more often, expressing regret that he hadn't been more aware of the growing tensions before they exploded so publicly. On Saturday morning, exactly 1 week after my birthday, Melissa finally made her next move. I was reading in my living room when I heard a car door slam with unusual force. Through my front window, I watched her march up my walkway with rigid posture and determined expression that suggested she'd been rehearsing this encounter for days. She knocked sharply on my door and waited with obvious impatience for me to answer. When I opened it, she pushed past me without invitation and strode into my living room as if she owned the place. Her presumption was so blatant that I almost laughed, but I maintained my composure and calmly asked what had brought her by without calling first. Melissa positioned herself near my fireplace with her arms crossed and her chin raised in what I recognized as her intimidation stance from childhood arguments. She announced that she'd spent the week consulting with attorneys, financial advisors, and even a geriatric psychiatrist about my, quote, recent erratic behavior, and had developed a comprehensive plan to address my obvious confusion and protect my best interests. The audacity of her approach was breathtaking. Rather than acknowledging the validity of my concerns, or attempting to repair our damaged relationship, she doubled down on her strategy of portraying me as incompetent, and herself as my protective advocate. She'd apparently convinced herself that if she could gather enough professional opinions questioning my judgment, she could override my autonomous decisions and restore her inheritance expectations. Melissa pulled a manila folder from her oversized purse and began reading from what appeared to be a prepared statement. She cited statistics about elderly vulnerability to financial exploitation and emotional manipulation by unscrupulous individuals seeking to separate seniors from their assets. She referenced case studies about lonely older adults who'd been convinced to alter their estate plans by predatory advisors or organizations specializing in legacy giving scams. Her presentation was polished and persuasive, clearly designed to plant doubt about my mental acuity and the legitimacy of my recent decisions. She suggested that my involvement with the Community Foundation and my new friendships with women like Margaret and Dorothy represented classic warning signs of someone being groomed for financial exploitation. She even implied that my estate attorney might be part of an organized scheme targeting vulnerable elderly clients. I listened to this performance with growing amazement at her willingness to completely rewrite recent history to suit her narrative. The woman who dismissed my deepest values as dramatic nonsense was now positioning herself as my concerned protector against manipulation. The daughter who'd been secretly consulting attorneys about challenging my will was now claiming expertise about recognizing signs of elder abuse. When she finished reading her statement, Melissa set the folder aside and fixed me with what she probably imagined was a compassionate but firm expression. She explained that she'd arranged for me to undergo comprehensive psychiatric and cognitive evaluations to document my current mental status and provide baseline measurements for future monitoring. She'd also scheduled consultations with financial advisors who specialized in protecting elderly clients from making impulsive decisions they might later regret. Furthermore, she'd researched the legal process for establishing temporary guardianship in cases where family members exhibited signs of diminished capacity or susceptibility to external influence. She assured me that she had no desire to pursue such drastic measures, but wanted me to understand that options existed if I continued making choices that seemed irrational or harmful to my own interests. The implicit threat was unmistakable: submit to her evaluation process and reverse my estate planning decisions, or face legal proceedings designed to strip away my autonomy and decision-making authority. She was essentially offering me a choice between voluntary compliance and forced subjugation, presented with the false kindness of someone claiming to act in my best interests. I remained silent during her entire presentation, allowing her to reveal the full scope of her strategy before responding. When she finally stopped talking and waited for my reaction, I walked to my kitchen and put the kettle on for tea. The domestic normalcy of this action seemed to unnerve her more than any dramatic response might have. While the water heated, I retrieved my own folder from the kitchen counter and returned to the living room where Melissa stood fidgeting with obvious discomfort. I sat in my favorite armchair and gestured for her to take a seat as well, but she remained standing in what appeared to be an attempt to maintain positional authority in our conversation. I opened my folder and began reading from documents I'd prepared specifically for this anticipated encounter. The first was a detailed timeline of Melissa's behavior over the past year, documenting every dismissive comment, every demonstration of financial focus over emotional connection, and every attempt to position herself as my decision-making authority rather than my supportive daughter. The timeline included direct quotes from our conversations, specific dates and locations where incidents had occurred, and witness information where applicable. Margaret's report about the overheard legal consultation was documented with precise details about timing and content. My test conversation about estate planning was transcribed verbatim, highlighting Melissa's exclusive focus on maximizing her inheritance while showing no interest in honoring my values or memory. The second document was a comprehensive medical report from my primary care physician, completed just 3 days earlier at my request. Dr. Patterson had administered cognitive assessments, reviewed my medical history, and provided detailed documentation of my excellent mental acuity and emotional stability. His report explicitly stated that I showed no signs of dementia, depression, or any other condition that might impair my judgment or decision-making capacity. The third document was a letter from Patricia Hendricks, my estate attorney, confirming that my recent will revisions had been executed with full legal compliance and complete mental competency. Patricia had included her professional assessment of my understanding of the documents, my clear articulation of my reasoning, and her confidence that my decisions reflected my genuine values rather than external pressure or confusion. The fourth document was perhaps the most damaging to Melissa's credibility. It was a recording transcript from my birthday party, capturing her exact words during our confrontation. Reading her threats about challenging my mental competency and her dismissive comments about my irrational decisions provided clear evidence of her manipulative tactics and disregard for my autonomy. As I read through these documents, Melissa's confident demeanor gradually crumbled. She tried to interrupt several times, but I continued reading in calm, measured tones that emphasized the factual nature of my evidence, rather than any emotional reaction to her behavior. When I finished, I set the folder aside and looked at her with the patient expression I might use with a confused child. I explained that her strategy of portraying me as mentally incompetent was not only factually baseless, but legally problematic. Attempting to establish guardianship over a competent adult through false claims of diminished capacity could constitute fraud and abuse of legal proceedings. The documented evidence of her actual motivations and tactics would make such attempts counterproductive and potentially criminal. Moreover, her threats revealed the very character flaws that had prompted my estate planning changes in the first place. The daughter who truly loved and respected me would never threaten to strip away my legal autonomy simply because she disagreed with my financial decisions. Her willingness to pursue such extreme measures confirmed that she viewed me as an obstacle to her inheritance, rather than an individual deserving dignity and respect. I stood and walked to my china cabinet, retrieving a small wrapped package I'd prepared earlier that week. I handed it to Melissa and suggested she open it before we continued our conversation. Inside was a set of copies containing every document in my folder, along with additional materials she hadn't seen yet. The additional materials included correspondence with charitable organizations expressing gratitude for my planned donations and outlining specific programs that would be funded through my estate. Letters from nursing students who would benefit from the scholarship fund I'd established. Thank you notes from families who'd already received services through the community foundation programs I supported. These letters provided powerful evidence that my charitable giving reflected genuine values and careful consideration, rather than impulsive emotional decisions or susceptibility to manipulation. The recipients of my planned donations were real people with legitimate needs, not predatory organizations seeking to exploit vulnerable elderly clients. I also included documentation of my volunteer work with the Community Foundation, showing my active involvement in grant review processes and program development. This evidence demonstrated my clear understanding of how charitable organizations operated and my competence in evaluating their effectiveness and legitimacy. Finally, I'd included a copy of my complete estate plan, with dollar amounts and percentage allocations clearly specified. Melissa could see exactly how much she would inherit under my revised will and compare it to what she might have received under my previous documents. The difference was substantial but not punitive. She would still receive a meaningful inheritance that acknowledged our family relationship, while allowing the majority of my assets to support causes I considered more worthy. Melissa read through these materials with visible shock and growing panic. She'd clearly expected to find evidence of confusion or manipulation that would support her competency challenge. Instead, she was confronting comprehensive documentation of my mental clarity, careful planning, and legitimate charitable motivations. When she finished reading, she attempted a different approach. She sat down across from me and adopted a softer, more conciliatory tone. She apologized for being too aggressive in her initial presentation and acknowledged that she might have misunderstood my motivations. She suggested that perhaps we could find a compromise that honored my charitable interests while still providing adequate family inheritance. This shift in tactics was so transparent that it actually made me angry for the first time during our confrontation. The woman who'd just threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent was now pretending to respect my judgment and seek collaborative solutions. Her willingness to completely reverse her approach based on tactical considerations, rather than genuine recognition of error, revealed the calculated nature of all her interactions with me. I told her that compromise was no longer possible because trust was no longer possible. Her threats had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, revealing a character so fundamentally flawed that I could no longer pretend we shared basic values about family relationships. The daughter who would threaten her mother's autonomy for financial gain was not someone I could continue loving or supporting. Melissa's mask finally slipped completely. She abandoned her conciliatory tone and reverted to the angry, entitled person I'd glimpsed at my birthday party. She accused me of being a vindictive old woman who was punishing her for minor disagreements and personality differences. She claimed that I was destroying our family out of spite and selfishness, choosing strangers over blood relatives who deserved my loyalty regardless of temporary conflicts. Her words revealed the depth of her sense of entitlement and her complete inability to understand why her behavior had been problematic. In her mind, she deserved my inheritance simply by virtue of being my daughter, regardless of how she treated me or whether she honored my values. My decision to redirect my assets toward charitable causes wasn't a response to her demonstrated character flaws, but an arbitrary act of cruelty toward someone who'd done nothing wrong. I listened to her tirade without interruption, allowing her to fully expose the selfishness and manipulation that had been lurking beneath her facade of family concern. When she finally ran out of accusations and self-justifications, I walked to my front door and opened it wide. I told her that our conversation was finished, and that she was no longer welcome in my home unless she was prepared to offer a genuine apology and demonstrate real change in her attitude and behavior. Since such change seemed unlikely given her complete inability to acknowledge any wrongdoing, I expected this would be our final private conversation. Melissa gathered her papers and purse with sharp, angry movements that reminded me of a child having a tantrum. As she reached the door, she turned back and made one final threat. She said that she would proceed with legal challenges to my competency and my estate plan, and that she had resources and connections that would make such challenges successful regardless of my current documentation. I responded that she was certainly free to waste her money on futile legal proceedings, but that doing so would only provide additional evidence of her manipulative character and disregard for my autonomy. Every attorney consultation, every filed motion, every attempt to override my clearly stated wishes would be documented and added to the record explaining why she'd forfeited her inheritance claims. After she left, I sat in my quiet living room feeling a profound sense of relief. The confrontation I'd been dreading for weeks was finally over, and it had unfolded exactly as I'd anticipated. Melissa had revealed herself completely, confirming that my revised estate plan reflected accurate assessments of her character rather than emotional overreactions to minor family tensions. I called Patricia Hendricks to report the conversation and provide copies of my documentation. She assured me that Melissa's threats were unlikely to succeed given the comprehensive evidence of my mental competency and the legitimate nature of my charitable decisions. She also advised me to limit future contact with Melissa to written communications only, creating clear records of any additional attempts at manipulation or intimidation. That evening, Margaret stopped by with dinner and moral support. She'd been worried about how the confrontation might affect my emotional state and wanted to ensure I wasn't second-guessing my decisions. I was able to report honestly that I felt more confident than ever about my choices and relieved to have the pretense of family harmony finally removed. We spent the evening reviewing my documentation and discussing strategies for moving forward. Margaret suggested that I might want to share my story with other elderly community members who were struggling with similar family dynamics. My willingness to stand up to manipulation and demand respect could provide encouragement and practical guidance for people who felt trapped by their adult children's expectations and threats. Over the following days, word of my confrontation with Melissa continued spreading through Cedar Falls' elderly community. Several women approached me at church and in grocery stores to express admiration for my courage and share their own stories of family disappointment and manipulation. Many had adult children who treated them as financial resources, rather than individuals deserving respect and consideration. Some of these women had been pressured to sign over property or assets prematurely, often through emotional manipulation about family unity and parental obligation. Others had been subjected to criticism and control regarding their lifestyle choices, as if reaching a certain age automatically forfeited their right to autonomy. Almost all had experienced the painful realization that their adult children viewed them primarily through the lens of inheritance expectations, rather than genuine affection. These conversations reinforced my understanding that elder abuse often took subtle forms that were difficult to recognize and address. Adult children who would never physically harm their parents had no qualms about emotional manipulation, financial pressure, or threats to legal autonomy when their inheritance expectations were threatened. The fact that such behavior was often disguised as concern for parental welfare made it particularly insidious and hard to combat. I began developing informal support networks for elderly community members who were dealing with similar challenges. We met weekly at the community center to share experiences, discuss legal options, and provide emotional encouragement for people who were struggling to maintain their dignity and autonomy in relationships with manipulative adult children. These meetings became surprisingly popular, attracting participants from surrounding towns who'd heard about our group through word of mouth. We invited guest speakers including elder law attorneys, financial advisors, and social workers, who specialized in recognizing and addressing family dynamics that bordered on abuse. The information and support we provided helped many people develop strategies for protecting themselves while maintaining whatever family relationships remained salvageable. My story became a case study in how to document problematic behavior, gather supporting evidence, and present clear consequences for manipulation and disrespect. Other group members began implementing similar strategies in their own situations, creating written records of conversations and establishing firm boundaries with adult children who treated them poorly. The photography program I'd endowed through the Community Foundation officially launched 6 weeks after my birthday confrontation. The first recipient was the young mother whose husband was battling cancer, and the portraits Sarah created for their family were breathtakingly beautiful. The images captured not only the visual documentation the mother had requested, but the deep love and connection that bound their family together during an incredibly difficult time. Seeing those photographs reminded me why I'd been so passionate about preserving family memories throughout my own life. The pictures weren't just decorative objects or sentimental clutter. They were tangible evidence of relationships that mattered, moments that deserved to be remembered, and love that transcended temporary circumstances. The mother's gratitude for having these images reinforced my conviction that supporting this program was one of the most meaningful ways I could invest my legacy. The Nursing Scholarship Fund also began accepting applications, with the first awards scheduled for presentation at the community college's spring ceremony. The recipients would be non-traditional students like I had been, people who were pursuing healthcare careers despite financial challenges and family responsibilities that made education particularly difficult. Reading through the scholarship applications reminded me of my own struggles as a young single mother trying to build a career while raising Melissa. These students faced similar challenges but would receive support that I'd never had access to. Knowing that my life's savings would help them achieve their dreams felt infinitely more satisfying than the prospect of simply enriching Melissa's already comfortable lifestyle. As spring approached, I felt increasingly peaceful about my decisions and optimistic about my future. My house remained filled with photographs that documented my values and priorities, but they no longer felt like shrines to a relationship that had ended. Instead, they represented evidence of the love and dedication I'd brought to motherhood, regardless of how that investment had ultimately been received. I continued my volunteer work with the Community Foundation, expanded my photography skills through advanced classes, and deepened my friendships with women who shared my values and appreciated my company. The life I was building reflected my authentic self, rather than the role I'd played as Melissa's devoted mother, and I discovered interests and capabilities I'd never had time to explore. Tyler visited regularly, often staying for dinner and homework sessions that reminded me of his mother's childhood. His presence provided continuity with positive aspects of my family relationships while allowing me to avoid the toxicity that had developed with his parents. He seemed to understand that the conflict between his mother and me reflected deeper issues than simple generational differences or temporary misunderstandings. Through Tyler, I learned that Melissa had indeed consulted with additional attorneys about challenging my estate plan, but that their assessments had been uniformly discouraging. The evidence of my mental competency was too comprehensive, my charitable motivations too well documented, and my legal representation too thorough for any challenge to have reasonable prospects of success. Derek had apparently tried to convince Melissa to accept the inheritance she would receive and focus on rebuilding our relationship rather than pursuing futile legal action. He seemed to understand that her confrontational approach was more likely to result in complete estrangement than restored inheritance prospects. But Melissa remained convinced that I would eventually cave to pressure or guilt and restore her previous inheritance expectations. This information confirmed my assessment that Melissa had learned nothing from our confrontations and remained fundamentally incapable of understanding why her behavior had been problematic. She continued to view our conflict as a temporary setback that could be overcome through persistence and pressure, rather than a permanent consequence of her demonstrated character flaws. I felt no sadness about this realization, only relief that I'd accurately assessed her true nature and responded appropriately. The daughter who couldn't acknowledge wrongdoing or demonstrate genuine change didn't deserve the blind devotion I'd offered for so many years. My life was richer and more peaceful without the constant stress of trying to maintain a relationship with someone who didn't respect or value me as an individual. As my 76th birthday approached, I began planning another celebration that would mark how much my life had changed since the previous year's confrontation. This time, the guest list would include only people who genuinely cared about my welfare and appreciated my company. The photographs taken at this gathering would document authentic relationships based on mutual respect, rather than the superficial family harmony I'd tried to maintain for too many years. The transformation in my daily life became most apparent during the quiet moments when I no longer felt the weight of disappointing expectations, or the anxiety of maintaining superficial harmony. Spring mornings found me tending my expanded garden with genuine pleasure rather than nervous energy, planting flowers that would bloom according to their own schedule, rather than performing for someone else's approval. The house felt lighter somehow, as if removing the pretense of conditional love had allowed authentic joy to settle into corners that had been shadowed by resentment and manipulation. My 76th birthday arrived on a brilliantly clear day in late April, with sunshine streaming through windows that showcased my photograph collections in ways that emphasized beauty rather than burden. This year's celebration would be entirely different from the previous year's confrontation, designed to honor genuine relationships and mark the completion of my transition from victim to architect of my own destiny. I'd invited 12 people, each representing a different aspect of the life I'd built since establishing my independence from Melissa's manipulation. Margaret and Dorothy were there, of course, along with Helen and the other women from our support group. Tyler had asked permission to attend, explaining that he wanted to show his respect for my courage, even if it meant acknowledging the painful distance between his mother and me. Sarah, the photographer, came as a guest, rather than hired professional this time, bringing a beautiful handmade album containing the images from last year's confrontation, alongside more recent pictures from our community foundation events. Patricia Hendricks surprised me by accepting my invitation, explaining that she'd been moved by my story and wanted to celebrate what she called a masterclass in dignified resistance to family manipulation. Dr. Patterson attended as well, having become something of a friend through our conversations about aging with autonomy and purpose. His presence provided additional validation that my decisions reflected sound judgment, rather than the emotional instability Melissa had tried to suggest. The local librarian, Mrs. Chen, joined us after I donated my photography books to create a memorial collection for community members interested in preserving family histories. The guest list also included 2 nursing scholarship recipients who'd specifically requested to meet the donor whose generosity had made their education possible. Maria was a 43-year-old single mother returning to school after her divorce, while James was a former construction worker pursuing healthcare certification after a back injury ended his previous career. Their stories reminded me why supporting education felt so much more meaningful than simply enriching people who already enjoyed comfortable lifestyles. As we gathered in my living room for the traditional toast, I looked around at faces that reflected genuine affection and respect, rather than obligation or calculation. These people had chosen to be here because they valued my company and wanted to celebrate my continued growth and independence. None of them were counting the years until my death, or calculating the value of my possessions. Tyler raised his glass first, offering a toast that brought tears to my eyes with its sincerity and maturity. He said that watching me stand up for my values had taught him important lessons about self-respect and the difference between love and manipulation. He promised that he would always remember these lessons in his own relationships, ensuring that the next generation would understand the importance of treating elderly family members with dignity and genuine care. Maria shared how the scholarship had changed not only her financial situation, but her entire outlook on the future. She explained that knowing someone believed in her potential had given her confidence to pursue goals she'd previously considered impossible. Her youngest daughter had started talking about becoming a doctor, inspired by her mother's example of refusing to accept limitations imposed by circumstances or other people's expectations. James spoke about the difference between charity that creates dependency and support that empowers independence. He said my scholarship program represented the latter because it required recipients to demonstrate commitment and effort while providing the resources needed to achieve meaningful goals. His words reminded me that effective generosity required careful thought about outcomes, rather than simple emotional responses to perceived need. Dr. Patterson offered professional observations about the correlation between personal autonomy and physical health in elderly populations. He cited research showing that people who maintained control over their own decisions and relationships enjoyed better cognitive function, improved immune response, and increased longevity compared to those who allowed others to manage their lives. My story provided a perfect example of how reclaiming agency could reverse declining health patterns associated with stress and helplessness. Patricia Hendricks shared legal perspectives on the increasing prevalence of elder financial abuse and emotional manipulation within families. She explained that my documentation methods and boundary-setting strategies could serve as a model for other elderly clients facing similar challenges. She'd already incorporated elements of my approach into her standard recommendations for protecting vulnerable clients from predatory family members. As the afternoon progressed, our conversation naturally evolved into discussions about legacy and meaning that went far beyond financial considerations. Each guest shared their own thoughts about what they hoped to leave behind and how they wanted to be remembered after death. These reflections reinforced my conviction that true legacy involved values and impact rather than asset transfer to ungrateful beneficiaries. Mrs. Chen described her work preserving local history through oral interviews and photograph digitization projects. She explained how family stories and images provided irreplaceable windows into community development and cultural change over time. Her words validated my lifelong passion for photography while highlighting the broader significance of preserving authentic family narratives rather than sanitized versions designed to hide uncomfortable truths. Helen shared updates about her relationship with her previously manipulative son, who had gradually demonstrated genuine change through consistent actions rather than empty promises. She emphasized that reconciliation required sustained effort and acknowledgement of wrongdoing, not just temporary modifications in behavior designed to restore financial benefits. Her story offered hope that family relationships could sometimes be repaired when both parties committed to authentic communication and mutual respect. Dorothy announced her decision to restructure her own estate plan based on lessons learned from my experience. She'd realized that her adult children had been making assumptions about their inheritance while showing little interest in her actual welfare or values. She planned to implement similar documentation strategies and conditional bequests that would reward genuine care while discouraging manipulative behavior. The birthday celebration continued into early evening, with guests sharing personal stories, offering mutual support, and strengthening the community bonds that had become so important to my happiness and security. As people prepared to leave, several mentioned their intention to maintain regular contact and continue building the relationships that had developed through our shared experiences and values. Tyler stayed after other guests departed, helping with cleanup while processing the conversations he'd witnessed. He seemed particularly moved by the scholarship recipients' stories and asked thoughtful questions about my decision to prioritize education support over family inheritance. I explained that investing in people's potential felt infinitely more rewarding than simply transferring wealth to individuals who already enjoyed comfortable circumstances. He mentioned that his perspective on inheritance and family obligation had evolved significantly since last year's confrontation. He'd initially felt confused and upset about the conflict between his mother and me, but gradually came to understand that respect couldn't be demanded or assumed based on biological relationships alone. He promised to remember these lessons when he became responsible for elderly family members, ensuring that he would honor their autonomy rather than treating them as burdens to be managed. As Tyler prepared to leave, he handed me a letter he'd written but hadn't planned to share unless the moment felt right. Inside was a heartfelt apology for not recognizing his mother's manipulative behavior sooner and for failing to support me during the initial stages of our conflict. He acknowledged that fear of family disruption had made him complicit in tolerating disrespectful treatment of someone he genuinely loved and admired. The letter continued with expressions of gratitude for the example I'd set about standing up to manipulation while maintaining dignity and grace. He wrote that my courage had inspired him to examine his own relationships more carefully and establish healthier boundaries with people who took his kindness for granted. He promised to visit regularly regardless of his parents' approval and to ensure that our relationship remained strong and independent of family politics. Reading Tyler's letter provided a profound sense of validation that my choices had created positive ripple effects beyond my immediate situation. If my example could help one young person develop healthier relationship patterns and stronger personal boundaries, then the painful process of confronting Melissa's manipulation had served purposes beyond my own liberation and self-respect. That night, I updated my journal with reflections on how dramatically my life had changed since the previous year's birthday confrontation. The woman who had absorbed criticism and questioned her own judgment had evolved into someone who confidently defended her values and maintained clear boundaries with people who treated her poorly. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but through sustained effort to prioritize self-respect over false harmony. I'd also developed a deeper understanding of the difference between loneliness and solitude. The isolation I'd feared if I stood up to Melissa's manipulation had never materialized because genuine relationships had filled the void left by removing superficial family connections. The quality of my social interactions had improved dramatically when I stopped tolerating disrespect and started surrounding myself with people who appreciated my authentic self. The charitable programs I'd endowed were generating regular updates about their impact and effectiveness. The photography program had served 15 families in its first 6 months, creating precious memories for people facing terminal illness, military deployment, or economic hardship that would have prevented professional portrait sessions. Each thank you letter reinforced my conviction that supporting meaningful programs felt infinitely more satisfying than enriching ungrateful relatives. The nursing scholarship had attracted applications from across the region, with selection committees noting the exceptional quality and diversity of candidates seeking support. The program had already gained recognition for its innovative approach to supporting non-traditional students who brought life experience and dedication to their healthcare studies. Plans were underway to expand the program based on initial success and additional donor interest. My work with the Elder Support Group had evolved into a formal organization with regular meeting schedules, guest speakers, and resource development projects. We'd created informational materials about recognizing financial abuse, establishing legal protections, and maintaining autonomy while aging. Several members had successfully implemented strategies similar to mine, reclaiming control over their own lives while setting clear boundaries with manipulative family members. The group had also attracted attention from social services agencies and legal aid organizations interested in our approaches to elder advocacy and empowerment. We'd been invited to present workshops at senior centers throughout the region, sharing practical strategies for recognizing manipulation and developing effective responses to family members who treated elderly relatives as resources rather than individuals deserving respect. These speaking engagements had connected me with hundreds of elderly people facing similar challenges, many of whom had felt isolated and helpless until learning about successful resistance strategies. The feedback consistently emphasized how empowering it felt to realize that submitting to disrespectful treatment wasn't an inevitable consequence of aging, but a choice that could be changed through education and community support. Patricia Hendricks had become something of a specialist in elder protection law, partly based on insights gained from my case. She developed comprehensive documentation protocols and legal strategies that other attorneys were adopting to help elderly clients protect themselves from family manipulation. She frequently cited my story as an example of how proper preparation and community support could enable people to maintain their autonomy even when facing significant pressure from relatives. 6 months after my birthday celebration, I received unexpected news that Melissa had finally abandoned her legal challenges to my estate plan. Tyler reported that his parents had decided to, quote, move forward, rather than continuing to pursue what their attorneys had consistently described as futile litigation. Derek had apparently convinced Melissa that maintaining some relationship with me was preferable to complete estrangement that would result from prolonged legal harassment. This information came without any direct communication from Melissa herself, who had apparently concluded that acknowledging defeat would be too humiliating to contemplate. Her silence spoke volumes about her continued inability to accept responsibility for the consequences of her own choices. The daughter who could have repaired our relationship through genuine apology and demonstrated change had chosen pride over reconciliation, ensuring that her inheritance would remain limited to the modest amount I designated. I felt no satisfaction from her capitulation, only relief that the threat of legal harassment had finally ended. The energy I'd devoted to documenting her behavior and protecting my decisions could now be redirected toward more positive pursuits. The peaceful life I'd built since establishing my independence would no longer be shadowed by anticipation of courtroom battles or competency challenges. Tyler's visits became more frequent and relaxed once the legal tensions subsided. He seemed relieved to maintain our relationship without the stress of divided loyalties or family politics. Our conversations covered his college preparations, career interests, and relationship goals, with frequent references to lessons he'd learned from observing my transformation and boundary-setting process. He decided to pursue social work as a career path, partly inspired by witnessing the positive impact of community support networks and advocacy programs. His academic focus would include elder care and family dynamics, with particular attention to preventing abuse disguised as concern or obligation. He credited our relationship with teaching him the importance of treating elderly people as autonomous individuals rather than burdens requiring management. 1 year after my 76th birthday, I received a formal invitation to speak at the state conference on elder rights and protection. The organizers had learned about my story through Patricia's presentations and wanted me to address the conference about successful strategies for maintaining autonomy and dignity while aging. The invitation represented recognition that my experience had broader significance beyond my personal situation. Preparing for the conference presentation required me to analyze and articulate the specific steps that had enabled my transformation from victim to advocate. I identified key elements including documentation of problematic behavior, development of community support networks, consultation with specialized attorneys, and implementation of consequences that reflected stated values rather than empty threats. The presentation also emphasized the importance of distinguishing between temporary family conflicts and patterns of fundamental disrespect that required permanent boundary changes. Many elderly people endured manipulative treatment because they hoped relationships would eventually improve if they remained patient and accommodating. My experience demonstrated that such hope was often misplaced when dealing with people who viewed elderly relatives as obstacles rather than individuals deserving consideration. The conference audience included social workers, attorneys, healthcare providers, and family members, seeking to better understand and address elder abuse within their own communities and professional practice. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with numerous requests for additional presentations and consultations about developing similar support programs in other regions. Following the conference, I was contacted by a publisher interested in developing my story into a book that could reach broader audiences facing similar challenges. The prospect of sharing my experience on a national scale felt both exciting and daunting, but ultimately aligned with my commitment to helping other elderly people recognize their own power to demand respect and maintain autonomy. The book project would require extensive reflection on my journey, from passive victim to active advocate, with particular attention to the practical strategies that had proven most effective in my situation. The publisher emphasized interest in providing readers with actionable guidance, rather than simply sharing my personal story, ensuring that the book would serve educational purposes beyond entertainment value. As I approached my 77th birthday, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that humiliating moment at the photography studio when Melissa had dismissed my values as dramatic nonsense. The woman who had questioned her own judgment and absorbed criticism without resistance had evolved into someone who confidently advocated for herself and others facing similar challenges. The house that had once felt like a shrine to an unappreciated relationship now served as a gathering place for genuine community and meaningful purpose. The photographs that lined my walls told stories of authentic connections rather than documenting the performance of superficial family harmony. The financial resources I'd accumulated through decades of sacrifice were supporting causes that reflected my values, rather than enriching people who took my devotion for granted. Most importantly, I'd discovered that demanding respect didn't make me selfish or dramatic. It made me someone worth respecting. The fear that standing up to manipulation would result in isolation had proven completely unfounded because genuine relationships had flourished once I stopped tolerating counterfeit versions based on obligation rather than affection. Tyler graduated from high school that spring with plans to attend college on a partial scholarship he'd earned through academic achievement and community service. His graduation speech included references to the importance of treating elderly family members with dignity and gratitude, earning him a standing ovation from an audience that included many grandparents who rarely received such public acknowledgement of their value and contributions. He spent the summer before college working with our elder advocacy group, helping to develop educational materials and coordinate support services for elderly community members. His energy and technological skills complemented our experience and wisdom, creating an intergenerational partnership that enhanced our effectiveness while providing him with practical experience in his chosen field. The photography program I'd endowed expanded to include training workshops for volunteers who wanted to provide portrait services for families in need. Sarah developed a curriculum that taught basic technical skills while emphasizing the emotional significance of preserving family memories during difficult times. The program attracted participants from various backgrounds who shared a commitment to helping others document their most precious relationships. The nursing scholarship program had grown large enough to support multiple recipients each semester, with plans for further expansion based on additional donor contributions inspired by the program's success. The recipients consistently demonstrated exceptional academic performance and professional commitment, validating my belief that investing in education provided more meaningful returns than simply transferring wealth to unappreciative family members. My advocacy work had evolved into a part-time consulting practice, where I helped other elderly people develop strategies for protecting their autonomy and assets from manipulative family members. The work was emotionally challenging but deeply rewarding, particularly when clients successfully implemented boundary changes that improved their quality of life and self-respect. Each success story reinforced my understanding that the problem of elder abuse within families was much more widespread than generally acknowledged. Many elderly people endured financial manipulation, emotional pressure, and autonomy violations because they believed they had no alternatives or support systems. Demonstrating that effective resistance was possible empowered them to reclaim control over their own lives and relationships. The book manuscript progressed steadily through multiple drafts and editorial revisions, with publication scheduled for the following year. The process of organizing my experiences into a coherent narrative helped me recognize patterns and insights that might benefit other readers facing similar challenges. The publisher's marketing team was already planning promotional tours and media appearances designed to reach elderly audiences who might need encouragement to advocate for themselves. As autumn approached, I began planning my 77th birthday celebration with the same attention to meaningful relationships and authentic purpose that had characterized the previous year's gathering. The guest list would include many of the same people, along with new friends and colleagues I'd met through my advocacy work and volunteer activities. The celebration would also mark the completion of my transformation from someone who absorbed disrespect to someone who commanded it through consistent demonstration of self-worth and clear boundaries. The journey had required courage I didn't know I possessed, and resulted in a life richer and more purposeful than I'd ever imagined possible. Looking back on the confrontation that had initiated this transformation, I felt grateful for Melissa's inability to hide her true character and motivations. Her dismissive comment about my being dramatic about family photographs had inadvertently given me permission to be dramatic in ways that actually mattered. Dramatically changing my will, dramatically restructuring my relationships, and dramatically reclaiming my own life from people who had taken my devotion for granted. The photographs that still lined my walls told a more complete story now, one that included not just the documentation of family relationships, but the evidence of personal growth and community connections that had flourished when I stopped sacrificing my own dignity for other people's comfort. The images captured moments of genuine joy and authentic connection, rather than the performance of obligatory family harmony. Rita Lawson at 77 was fundamentally different from Rita Lawson at 74, not just in circumstances but in character and confidence. The woman who had once questioned her own perceptions and absorbed criticism without resistance had become someone who trusted her judgment and maintained clear boundaries with people who treated her poorly. The transformation had required painful acknowledgement of family dysfunction, but had resulted in a life of genuine purpose and meaningful relationships that enriched each day with possibility rather than obligation. 5 years had passed since that pivotal moment when I'd been called dramatic for caring about family photographs, and the woman I'd become bore little resemblance to the one who had silently absorbed that humiliation. At 81, I moved through my days with a confidence and purpose that surprised even me. The house that had once felt like a monument to unappreciated sacrifice now buzzed with activity as a hub for community advocacy and genuine friendship. The morning routine I'd established reflected my new priorities perfectly. I woke each day to sunlight streaming through windows that showcased not just family photographs but images from community events, scholarship ceremonies, and advocacy meetings that documented a life lived on my own terms. The coffee I prepared was savored rather than rushed, accompanied by letters from scholarship recipients, updates from charitable programs, and invitations to speaking engagements that validated the impact of my transformation. My book, Dramatic Changes: Reclaiming Your Life After Family Betrayal, had exceeded all publishing expectations, spending 6 weeks on regional bestseller lists and generating hundreds of letters from readers who found courage in my story to address their own family dysfunction. The success had led to a monthly advice column in a national magazine for seniors, where I addressed questions about setting boundaries with adult children, protecting assets from family manipulation, and building meaningful relationships after cutting ties with toxic relatives. The correspondence was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Elderly people wrote from across the country, sharing stories of financial abuse disguised as family concern, emotional manipulation presented as love, and isolation imposed by adult children who treated their parents as burdens rather than individuals deserving respect. Many had endured years of mistreatment because they believed they had no alternatives, or that standing up for themselves would be selfish and destructive. My responses emphasized practical strategies while validating their experiences and emotions. I'd learned that most elderly victims of family manipulation needed permission to trust their own perceptions before they could implement protective measures. Years of gaslighting and guilt-inducing rhetoric had trained them to question their judgment and prioritize their abuser's comfort over their own dignity and safety. The elder advocacy organization I'd helped establish had grown into a regional network with chapters in 12 cities, each providing support groups, legal resources, and educational programs for elderly people facing family manipulation. We'd trained dozens of volunteers to recognize signs of elder abuse and provide appropriate referrals and support. The impact extended far beyond individual cases to influence policy discussions and professional training programs for social workers, attorneys, and healthcare providers. One of our most successful initiatives was the Dignity Documentation Project, which taught elderly people to create comprehensive records of their decision-making capacity, financial management skills, and family relationship dynamics. These records served as protection against false claims of incompetency while providing evidence for legal proceedings when family members attempted to override autonomous choices through manipulation or coercion. The project had prevented countless cases of inappropriate guardianship proceedings and given elderly people tools to maintain control over their own lives, even when facing pressure from relatives who disagreed with their choices. Court systems throughout the region had begun incorporating our documentation standards into their evaluation processes, creating additional barriers against frivolous competency challenges. Patricia Hendricks had leveraged her experience with my case to establish a specialized elder law practice that had become a model for attorneys in other states. She frequently spoke at legal conferences about innovative approaches to protecting elderly clients from family manipulation, using carefully anonymized versions of my story to illustrate effective documentation and boundary-setting strategies. Her practice had developed standardized protocols for evaluating family dynamics during estate planning consultations, helping attorneys identify clients who might be vulnerable to pressure or coercion from relatives expecting large inheritances. The protocols included specific warning signs such as family members who insisted on attending all appointments, relatives who spoke for elderly clients, or adult children who focused exclusively on financial aspects of estate plans, rather than honoring their parents' values and wishes. The nursing scholarship program I'd endowed had become a permanent endowment supporting 24 students annually, with additional funding from donors inspired by the program's success and the recipient's exceptional performance. The scholarship had gained recognition for its innovative approach to supporting non-traditional students, who brought life experience and dedication to their healthcare studies. The most recent scholarship ceremony had included 3 graduates who were now working as registered nurses in local hospitals, providing direct evidence of the program's impact on community healthcare. Their success stories were regularly featured in fundraising materials for the Community Foundation, attracting additional donors who wanted to support education programs with demonstrated effectiveness. Maria, the single mother who had been among my first scholarship recipients, had graduated with honors and accepted a position in the pediatric intensive care unit, where she specialized in supporting families during medical crises. She'd written to thank me not just for the financial support, but for the example I'd set about the importance of maintaining dignity and self-respect even in difficult circumstances. James, the former construction worker who had pursued healthcare certification after his injury, had become a licensed practical nurse working in rehabilitation services. His patient advocacy skills were exceptional, partly because his own experience with family disappointment had taught him to recognize and address situations where patients weren't receiving appropriate support from relatives. The photography program had evolved beyond my original vision to become a comprehensive family legacy preservation service. In addition to providing free portrait sessions for families facing hardship, the program now offered workshops on digital archiving, storytelling techniques, and historical documentation for community members interested in preserving their family histories. Sarah had developed partnerships with local schools and community colleges to provide internship opportunities for students interested in photography careers while expanding the program's capacity to serve more families. The workshops attracted participants from diverse backgrounds who shared a commitment to preserving authentic family narratives, rather than sanitized versions designed to hide uncomfortable truths. The program had also attracted attention from historians and anthropologists interested in documenting how families navigated economic challenges, health crises, and social changes in contemporary America. Several academic papers had featured images and stories from our program, providing broader recognition of the importance of preserving ordinary family experiences as historical documentation. Tyler had completed his undergraduate degree in social work with a specialization in gerontology, writing his senior thesis on family dynamics and elder abuse prevention strategies. His research included case studies from our advocacy organization, with particular focus on the effectiveness of peer support groups and community education programs in helping elderly people recognize and address manipulation. He'd been accepted to graduate school with plans to pursue advanced training in elder rights advocacy and family mediation. His career goals included establishing specialized services for elderly people who had been estranged from their families due to abuse or manipulation, helping them build new support networks and maintain their autonomy while aging. Our relationship had become even stronger over the years, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than obligation or expectation. He visited regularly, often bringing friends who were studying similar issues and wanted to learn from my experience and advocacy work. These conversations reminded me that the next generation was more aware of elder abuse issues and better prepared to recognize and address family manipulation. Tyler had also maintained limited contact with his parents, though their relationship remained strained by their inability to acknowledge the validity of my concerns or take responsibility for their manipulative behavior. He'd established clear boundaries with them, refusing to serve as an intermediary or to discuss my personal affairs during their conversations. His example had influenced several of his college friends to examine their own family dynamics more critically, leading to improved relationships in some cases, and necessary boundary setting in others. The ripple effects of my transformation continued expanding through his generation, creating awareness and prevention strategies that might protect future elderly people from similar manipulation. The speaking engagements that had started with a single conference presentation had evolved into a regular schedule of workshops, keynote addresses, and media appearances throughout the region. I'd addressed audiences ranging from professional conferences to church groups, senior centers to university classes, sharing insights about recognizing manipulation and maintaining autonomy while aging. Each presentation generated new connections with people facing similar challenges, creating an informal network of support and advocacy that extended far beyond formal organizational structures. The feedback consistently emphasized how empowering it felt to realize that submitting to disrespectful treatment wasn't an inevitable consequence of aging, but a choice that could be changed through education and community support. One particularly memorable presentation was at a national conference on elder rights, where I shared the stage with legal experts, healthcare professionals, and policy advocates from across the country. The audience included adult children who were struggling to understand appropriate boundaries with their aging parents, healthcare providers who needed to recognize signs of family manipulation, and elderly people who were seeking courage to address their own situations. The most meaningful part of these speaking engagements was the private conversations that occurred afterward, when individuals approached to share their own stories and seek specific guidance for their situations. Many had endured years of mistreatment because they believed they had no alternatives, or that standing up for themselves would be selfish and destructive. I developed a standard set of resources to share with these individuals, including contact information for elder law attorneys, documentation templates, and referrals to local support groups or advocacy organizations. The goal was always to empower people to take control of their own situations, rather than creating dependency on my advice or intervention. The media attention generated by my book and advocacy work had led to interviews with national publications and television programs focused on aging and family issues. These appearances provided opportunities to reach even broader audiences while raising awareness about the prevalence of elder abuse within families that appeared functional from the outside. One interview that particularly resonated with viewers was on a morning television program where I discussed the difference between supporting elderly parents and controlling them. The host had initially seemed skeptical about my decision to reduce Melissa's inheritance, but gradually understood the distinction between reasonable family involvement and manipulative behavior disguised as concern. The segment generated hundreds of viewer responses, with many people expressing gratitude for seeing their own experiences validated and normalized. The overwhelming response demonstrated how many families struggled with similar dynamics, while lacking language or frameworks to understand and address the manipulation. Margaret remained one of my closest friends and most reliable supporters, though she developed some health challenges that required additional assistance with daily activities. Our friendship had deepened over the years as we'd supported each other through various challenges and celebrated numerous successes in our advocacy work and personal growth. She'd implemented her own version of my documentation strategies when her nephew began pressuring her to sell her house and move to assisted living despite her excellent health and independent functioning. The records she'd created provided clear evidence of his financial motivations and her continued competency, enabling her to maintain her autonomy while setting firm boundaries with relatives who prioritized their inheritance expectations over her preferences. Dorothy had become something of a legend in our community for her own dramatic response to family manipulation. After discovering that her son had been intercepting her mail and managing her finances without permission, she'd filed criminal charges and completely restructured her estate plan to support educational programs for elderly people learning to use technology independently. Her story had been featured in local newspapers as an example of how elderly people could fight back against financial abuse, inspiring other victims to seek help rather than suffering in silence. She frequently spoke at our support group meetings about the importance of maintaining financial independence and monitoring account activity, regardless of family members' claims about acting in their parents' best interests. Helen had successfully reconciled with her previously manipulative son, but only after he'd demonstrated sustained change in his behavior and attitude over several years. Their relationship remained somewhat cautious, but had evolved into genuine mutual respect based on acknowledging past mistakes and committing to healthier interaction patterns. Her experience provided hope for other group members who wondered whether family relationships could ever be repaired after establishing firm boundaries. She emphasized that reconciliation required consistent demonstration of change rather than temporary modifications designed to restore financial benefits, and that trust had to be rebuilt gradually through sustained, respectful behavior. The Community Foundation had established a permanent memorial fund in my honor, despite my continued good health and active involvement in their programs. The fund would ensure that the photography program, scholarship initiatives, and advocacy resources would continue operating indefinitely, providing ongoing support for causes that reflected my values and priorities. The Memorial Fund had attracted donations from across the region, including contributions from former scholarship recipients, families served by the photography program, and individuals who'd attended my presentations or read my book. The support demonstrated how widely my story had resonated, and how many people shared my commitment to empowering elderly individuals while supporting meaningful charitable causes. Dr. Patterson continued serving as my primary care physician while also becoming a colleague in advocacy efforts focused on healthcare providers' role in recognizing and addressing elder abuse. He'd incorporated screening questions about family manipulation into his routine appointments with elderly patients, identifying numerous cases where medical decisions were being influenced by relatives' financial interests rather than patients' welfare. His advocacy had influenced other healthcare providers to develop similar screening protocols, creating additional safety nets for elderly people whose families might pressure them to accept inappropriate medical interventions or refuse necessary care based on inheritance considerations. The medical community's increased awareness represented another victory in the broader effort to protect elderly autonomy. Mrs. Chen had retired from her position at the library, but continued volunteering with our advocacy organization, while pursuing her own photography projects, documenting elderly community members' stories and experiences. Her work had become a valuable historical record, while providing elderly subjects with opportunities to share their wisdom and perspectives with younger generations. The photography project had evolved into a formal oral history program that captured not just images, but detailed interviews with elderly community members about their life experiences, family relationships, and lessons learned through various challenges. The collection was being archived for future researchers, while providing current participants with validation and recognition of their knowledge and experiences. As I reflected on these 5 years of transformation, I was struck by how completely my life had changed, while remaining fundamentally grounded in the same values that had motivated my original passion for family photography. The difference was that I now surrounded myself with people who shared and respected those values, rather than trying to maintain relationships with individuals who dismissed them as sentimental nonsense. The house that had once felt empty despite being filled with family photographs now buzzed with genuine activity and authentic relationships. The morning coffee that had once been consumed in worried silence was now shared with friends who valued my wisdom and experience. The evening hours that had once been spent anxiously reviewing interactions with manipulative family members were now filled with meaningful projects and satisfying accomplishments. Most importantly, the woman who had questioned her own perceptions and absorbed criticism without resistance had become someone who trusted her judgment and maintained clear boundaries with people who treated her poorly. The transformation hadn't eliminated all challenges or difficulties, but had provided tools and perspectives that enabled me to navigate problems with confidence rather than fear. The financial security I'd worked decades to achieve was now supporting causes that would continue making positive differences long after my death, rather than simply enriching people who had taken my devotion for granted. The photographs that documented my life told a complete story of growth, resilience, and authentic relationships rather than just the performance of obligatory family harmony. Rita Lawson, at 81, was living proof that it was never too late to demand respect, reclaim autonomy, and build a life of genuine meaning and purpose. The woman who had been called dramatic for caring about preserving family memories had discovered that being dramatic sometimes meant being brave enough to preserve your own dignity and self-worth, regardless of other people's comfort or expectations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.